Hello, and welcome back to another episode of General Conference Conversations, the podcast where we have conversations about General Conference. I am your host, Kaylin, and we today are starting on the Saturday afternoon session of April 2023 General Conference. I'm still getting used to doing 3 episodes a week, and how quickly that gets us through all of these talks, honestly. Because I was like, man, we're already Saturday afternoon session. We've only been doing this for like 2 weeks. But then, I have to remember I'm doing 3 episodes a week. So, it's crazy. Anyway, so of course the first talk, quote unquote, of the Saturday afternoon session was Standing of General Authorities, Area 70s and Other General Officers by Elder Andersen. But I'm not going to do a whole episode just for that. There would be a whole lot to talk about. It would just be me listing all of these sustainings, and that wouldn't be a very interesting episode. But, so we're going to talk about, excuse me, Elder Andersen's talk, Tithing, Opening the Windows of Heaven. And of course, I encourage you to listen to or watch or read this talk before you come listen to me talk about it. So you can get your own inspirations and questions and promptings and, things that you want to study further on your own time. And then hopefully I can add to it, help you think about something differently with a story or a way that I talk about something. But I'm going to jump on in. So of course this whole talk is about tithing, and he opens with a story about a family in South America, in Venezuela. I mean, it is in South America, but specifically in Venezuela. And he was told this story by this brother that in 2019 there was a bunch of problems. There were a bunch of problems in Venezuela that caused power outages, a power blackout for 5 days. And there was soon chaos and anarchy and a lot of desperate people who didn't have enough food or enough water. And so people started looting businesses and destroying everything. And this brother, he owned a bakery, and he was really worried that that was going to happen to their bakery. And he decided, as a family, they decided to give away all the food in their bakery to the people in need. And one particularly dark night, there were riots and looting everywhere, and he was so concerned about his family and the safety of his family. And the next morning, he went to their bakery, and even though a bunch of nearby food businesses had already been destroyed, their bakery wasn't. And he told his family about this when he got home, and their oldest son was 12, and he said, "I know why your store is protected. You and Mom always pay your tithes." And he said he thought about the promises that in Malachi where it talks about tithing. And of course, this is such an amazing story, and I've heard so many amazing stories from people as a missionary or just in talks and testimonies and lessons and whatever about their experiences with tithing and the amazing blessings that they've gotten from tithing. And I don't have any specific big crazy things about tithing personally, but one that always comes to mind when people ask me about my testimony of tithing specifically was my second year in college. I decided that I was going to do a study abroad program in England, and I was super, super excited and also very, very stressed because it was a lot of money to pay, as a college kid. And specifically as a college student in community college, I was used to very low tuition, which is part of the reason I went to community college, just because it was cheaper. But I was having to pay tuition and housing in England, and so it was going to be, I think it was like 4 times as much as I normally paid for a semester of school. And that was before like plane tickets and, all the money I spent actually doing things and like buying food and going places and like actually living in England. Anyway, so I was really stressed and a lot of crazy things happened. And I went to the temple just by myself, I think. I drove down for the day. We had 2.5 hours from the temple. And I drove down for the day. I think it was just me. Maybe I took my sister and my mom. Anyway, I was standing outside the temple. I didn't even go in. And I was walking around in the grounds, like really thinking about this and praying about it and being like, this, I want to do this. Is this something that I can do? Is there a way that I can, whatever. And I remember like thinking very clearly, tithing, like make sure you're paying your tithing. And I think I caught up on my tithing. I can't remember if I was like paying it consistently. I always forget to do it month to month, so I usually pay every like 3 or 4 months, or like right before tithing settlement, and I'm like, oh yeah, I need to pay all my tithing, because I'm just not in the habit of it. But I was able to afford going, partially from scholarships, partially from a little bit of money that I borrowed from my grandma, so I'd have it up front so I could actually do it. I paid off later. And I don't have any big crazy tithing experiences right in my life that something like this where I was like saved in this big way because of my tithing. But I do have little experiences like that. And also I think when we talk about tithing, and this is kind of the biggest like point I wanted to make about this particular talk, is we often think about tithing blessings as being temporal. You pay your tithing, which is usually money, right? Pay your tithing and you're going to be financially blessed. But that's not the blessings that were specifically promised, right? People are financially blessed because of tithing, because of keeping other commandments and covenants. But that's not the only way that we're blessed. And often it's not like, oh, I was given $100,000 yacht because I paid my tithing, right? It's like, oh, I scraped by. I managed to make my house payment or whatever, right? That's more of a God showing us that he's there and that he sees us, more than like, I'm going to make you wealthy because you're faithful to me, right? And Elder Andersen points this out. He's like, the windows of heaven, which are talked about in the promises that we have in Malachi for tithing, the windows of heaven open and pour out blessings. There's not going to be room enough to receive it, right? Those windows of heaven open a lot of different ways. Some are temporal, but many are spiritual. And sometimes they're super subtle and really easy to overlook, and sometimes they're like right in front of your face, smacks you upside the head, right? I think that goes for really any like covenants, commandments, promises, whatever that have promised blessings attached to them. Sometimes we have very specific ones, right? Like promised blessing of like the protection from the adversary, or things like that. But even things like that are I don't want to say they're vague, because they are specific, but they're not saying on this date, right? On this date at this time, you will be saved from temptation for this particular thing because you wore your garments today, right? We don't know what exact blessings come from every exact moment of obedience or exact, moments of faith. We just have to trust that we are being blessed and to see the blessings that we can see, and try not to quantify it. We talked about this in my last episode too, about the kingdoms of glory. Elder Oaks talks about, the final judgment isn't a sum total of all of the good and evil that we did. It's a sum total of who we've become. And I think God operates for us also in a similar way. It's not necessarily, oh, you did this thing, and so I'm going to let you know that because you did this thing, you're blessed in this specific way. It's like, you're being blessed just always. I mean, God's always blessing us, right? But when we get down to, like, we're trying to quantify it as well. We're trying to say, well, I put this deposit in, and so I should get this thing back. It's not a vending machine. And we get that minute of detail, I think we get discouraged of, like, well, I'm not being blessed for paying my tithing, right? I paid my tithing, I should be super rich by now, or I should be able to pay my house payment. Like, we're expecting these very specific blessings for things. We can miss the blessings that we're actually getting that may not look like the blessings we thought we were going to get. So, and also, this is a big part of this talk. Most of what I wanted to talk about today is the tie between temporal and spiritual things, right? And so Elder Andersen says this: the world speaks of tithing in terms of our money, but the sacred law of tithing is principally a matter of our faith. Being honest in our tithes is one way we show our willingness to put the Lord first in our lives above our own cares and interest. I promise you that as you trust in the Lord, the blessings of heaven will follow. I think it's interesting as well, and I've had this discussion with a lot of people, what do you pay tithing on? How do you pay your tithing? Because I think it honestly differs for everyone. We say 10% of your increase, but it's not saying 10% of your gross paycheck, right? Or 10% of every little bit of money that comes into your bank account. I know people who do pay tithing on birthday money. I didn't grow up paying tithing on birthday money, but I also know people who are like, I don't pay tithing on birthday money because I wouldn't pay tithing on a gift, and that's the gift that they're giving me, right? It's an increase, but it's not like that's just the way that I think about it, right? It's an increase. It would have been a gift. I wouldn't pay 10% of a doll that they gave me, or 10% of, a new book or something, right? Which I thought that's a really interesting way to think about it. And so some people pay tithing on their net pay, like what they have left over at the end of the month, like that's their increase. Some people pay it on every paycheck. That's what I do, just as like a peek into our finances. It's just like the paychecks between my husband and I, and well, I don't know if my husband does the same way or not, but for me personally, I get paid. I have 2 jobs, and so just on what comes into my bank account from those 2 jobs is what I pay my 10% of. It keeps it really simple for me in my brain. But also, like, when we do tithing settlement at the end of the year, our bishop doesn't ask, okay, how much money did you make this year, and this is how much tithing you paid, so did you actually pay all of your tithing, right? He asks, are you a full tithe payer? And it's down to us to say yes or no. And like that's really a conversation that we need to have, in my opinion. Right? I'm not a general authority, I'm not a prophet, but in my opinion, that's a conversation we need to have with God, between us, between, our spouse, if we share money or share, income or whatever, is how, what you're going to pay your tithing on, and if you're paying enough, quote unquote, right, that you are paying your 10%, you're being honest in your tithes. I liked that. That's the phrase that he used in this quote, is being honest in your tithes, and that doing so is showing your willingness to put the Lord first in your lives. You're showing that the spiritual is more important than the temporal, right? You're giving part of your earnings, your hard-earned money, back to the Lord, because, he's the one that gives to us in the first place, which we'll get into in a second, as a show of, it doesn't matter as much as you do. It doesn't matter as much, my material belongings don't matter as much as my spiritual growth and my spiritual worth and my connection and relationship with you. And I think it can be really easy to be cynical and say, well, I'm paying money to a church that's already very wealthy. And I think this talk is partially in response to that, right? Elder Andersen talks about a bunch of the places where our tithing goes. He lists, missionaries being able to go on missions, even though if they can't financially afford it, but our tithing helps to send them on missions, and building and renovating temples and building church buildings and helping, members of your own ward who need money or food or whatever, right? And it's really easy, and I go through this on a recurring cycle of why am I giving money to this church who is already so wealthy and they have all this money, and I have to remember, and sometimes it's really hard for me to remember, that this is a personal thing. It's not a show of, haha, I'm paying my tithing, I'm a better member than you, or I'm paying my tithing to this church so they can whatever. It's my own showing that I have faith in God that this money is not mine, it's his, and that it doesn't matter as much as my relationship with him does. That's how I view tithing. Maybe you view it very differently, and that's totally fair. And I know a lot of people who struggle with the concept of tithing, not because partially because they don't feel like they're in a very tough spot financially, and I also understand that. I've been in that tough spot financially, where you're I cannot possibly pay 10% of my money when I need every cent for myself and for my own needs, or the needs of my kids or my family. I need gas to drive to work, things like that. And also just on a conceptual basis, people struggle with tithing and paying tithing. And that's also very valid. I think any way that you feel about tithing is very valid. But to be reminded, of course, I love that he's reminding us in this talk that it is the connection between the physical and the spiritual. And he gives quite a few examples in here about tithing, and one of the things he talks about is accompanying Elder Eyring in 1998 to a big meeting in Utah, which is now known as Silicon Slopes, which is a community of great innovation and technology. And at the time, it was a big boom in technology there as well. And Elder Eyring cautioned the saints there against comparing what they had with others and wanting more. And he promised that as they paid an honest tithe, their desire for material possessions would diminish. And then within a couple of years, the technology bubble there burst and a bunch of people were out of jobs. But those who had paid an honest tithe and like were not trying to strive for more, and kept very realistic expectations, right? And paid on specifically the council to pay tithing, were blessed during that time. And then I want to read this one quote just a little bit before this story. Elder Andersen says, "The spiritual power of the divine law of tithing is not measured by the amount of money contributed, for both the prosperous and the poor are commanded by the Lord to contribute 10% of their income. The power comes from placing our trust in the Lord." And again, like just this obviously recurring theme of the importance of the spiritual over the physical. It's not how much you give, right? The widow's mite, she gave all that she had, and it was not very much, and people mocked her for it. We're not called upon to declare to our entire ward how much tithing we're paying, right? Nobody sees how much we actually pay. I mean, other than but even then, I guess our bishops don't see. I don't actually know how that process works. But we just tell them, we are full tithe payers. That's our declaration. That's our settlement. But I love this, this constant reminder. And this is not the only commandment that marries the temporal with the spiritual. In fact, a lot of commandments do that, and also that's how all of our ordinances are, right? We're doing physical actions, going through physical motions that are symbolic of making spiritual promises. We're rooting ourselves in the now with something that's spiritual. We can't see God, but we can wear our garments and be reminded that we've made covenants with Him and that we have a relationship with Him. We can't see the priesthood, but when we have a priesthood holder lay their hands upon our heads, we can, physically feel like the weight of the priesthood on our heads, right? And we have this kind of, so rituals are. This is what ordinances are, is a physical way to connect with these kind of abstract. They can seem abstract because we can't see covenants. We don't get a certificate of completion when we get our endowments, right? And so it's kind of this way to physically root us and go through physical motions of a spiritual experience. And so my question for you is, how does tithing and how do other temporal commandments or ordinances help you remember your connection to spiritual things? I think it can be really easy to start to go through the motions. I do this all the time, right? I take sacrament every week. At some point, you're going to get used to just taking the sacrament. It's not going to be new anymore, and you're just going to go through the motions and eat the bread and drink the water. And so it's easy to just pay your tithing at the end of the month and say, cool, I did my thing. But it's an extra step that's hard to do, take that extra step of no, I need to remember that the reason that I'm taking this bread and water is to remember my covenants. The reason that I'm giving this 10% is that I'm showing the Lord that my material possessions are not as important as my connection with Him. The reason that I'm physically walking through the temple and doing all of these physical things during the endowment ceremony is not because, I'm just doing it, but it's to, remind me of, symbolically, of the covenants, the promises that I've made to Him, and to be reminded of those. So that is my one question, my one only question, is how does tithing and how do other temporal commandments help you remember your connection to spiritual things? And Elder Andersen, of course, closes with his testimony of the important work that we are engaged in, basically, and that he reiterates President Nelson's promise that we will see the greatest manifestation of the Savior's power in the days to come. I am grateful to revisit tithing. Sometimes, like I said, tithing is kind of hard for me. I kind of vacillate between, why am I paying this? Why am I doing this? Why do I need to pay money to be part of this church? Or why am I paying to go to the temple? There's very cynical ways I think about it. But to be reminded of the promises that are given to us as we do pay tithing, it makes me feel a lot better. So I was grateful that I was able to read this. As always, read the footnotes. He has a lot of chunky footnotes in here, like packed full of, like I'm looking at footnote 8 and it has a scripture footnote, but then he also has like a whole other story. Just crazy. Yeah. And then like every other footnote in here is just packed full with extra commentary, quotes, references to scripture and talks and stuff. So absolutely check those out, because that was a lot in there if you want some further reading for this talk. That's all I've got for you today. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope that I was able to add a little bit to your study of this talk. As always, please follow me on Instagram and Facebook, General Conference Conversations. You can also subscribe on YouTube or follow on your podcatcher of choice. I also just love to hear from you. Emails, comments, messages, reviews. I love to hear your stories and your thoughts on different talks. And I will talk to y'all next time.